So now that we've already looked at Japhethite section, that wasn't as many names now as you can see that we're going to find under the Hamites and then under the Shemites. Ham has 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Sons of all of these sons are mentioned except any sons of Put. We're given sons of Cush, we're given sons of Mizraim, and they go in this order. Cush comes first, then Mizraim, then we're given descendants, sons of Canaan. Put is left out, but remember what we said covering the last group of people. Put was one name we're not going to cover. Now we'll explain the stars by the certain names here in a moment. We end up anyway with 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Then we end up from Cush and Mizraim with 3 great-grandsons, Sheba, Dedan, Philistine. And in between we've got grandsons, 24 of them, from Cush, from Mizraim, and from Canaan. Okay, under Cush we have Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Sabtika, Nimrod, which of course also we're not going to cover until chapter 11, and Raamah. And then we're given sons of Raamah, Sheba, and Dedan, who generally occur together in the Old Testament, though not always. Then under Mizraim, we have the Ludim. I think I forgot something. Ludim should have a star by it as well. I just forgot that. So we've got a star by Havilah, by Sheba, and Ludim should also have a star by it. That just slipped my mind in looking at it now. So Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim, Caphtorim. And then we're given 1 son of Caphtorim, which remember now you've got plurals here, so this isn't the person's name. This ends up being a group of people, but we'll leave it a person right now. 1 son from Caphtorim, Philistine. Now you're familiar with the Philistines in the Old Testament, so you'll know that they came now from a different line than the Israelites, because you get to other nations that Israel comes into contact with, like Assyria, and the Assyrians were a Semitic people or a Shemitic people, just like Israel was. So some nations would be Hamitic that they came into contact with, and others Shemitic. And the Assyrians were a descendant from Shem rather than from Ham. No descendants given from Put. I can mention here that what you've got in your Bible is P-H-U-T, and it should be just P-U-T. The H should be marked out. Put, P-U-T, not P-H-U-T. Then we have Canaan. And you're certainly familiar with Canaan, as well as a lot of names under him that you might not have been familiar with so much under the other ones. Sidon, Heth, Jebusite, Amorite, Girgasite, Hivite, Arkite, Sinite, Arvadite, Zimmerite, and Hamathite. 4 sons, 24 grandsons, 3 great-grandsons, a total of 31 names. As compared to 7 sons, 7 grandsons for Japheth, a total of 14 names. And these are found in the verses we just mentioned, verses 6 through 20. Now the Hamites are people that settled the following areas. They settled the southern parts of the Near Eastern belt, which stretches, well, I'll show you on the map when you get that down, from Israel to Babylon. Because notice who we've got right here, Canaan. He's a Hamite, and you know where Canaan is, that's Israel. So we got to find out the general areas where we're going to find Hamites. In the first place, they occupy the southern belt of the Near Eastern region, stretching from Israel to Babylon. They live in Arabia, as well as the Arabian Peninsula, and the northeastern portions of the continent of Africa. All people who live in Africa that are indigenous descended from Ham. Now, of course, that doesn't include South Africa, which has a lot of white people, because they're not indigenous. They came there at a much later date. But all of your people who are indigenous to the continent of Africa, as well as all black people everywhere, because they came from Africa, whether they're in this country or wherever they are, all of these people are descendants from the son of Noah, Ham. Now, if you can put the map back up on there. You got most of the names down? You can copy from someone else. I think a lot of you got the names down. We begin taking a look at however many of these we can get through. We might have a little extra time just to look at some examples here now under these names that I didn't know whether we would or not. Genesis 10, verse 6, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. So the Cushites and all of the rest of them here in verse 6 are all Hamites. They all come from Ham. Okay, we'll begin with Cush, which is the first mentioned son in Genesis 10:6 of Ham. There are only two biblical texts for the name Cush. One is in Isaiah 11:11, which we looked at in reference to the Isles of the Sea. We'll go back and point out that name to you. And the other reference is in the title to the 7th Psalm. Now, these are the only two places where this word Cush appears. Let's turn and look at each one of these, and you'll see what I mean. The title of the 7th Psalm, which is rather unique to have this name appearing there. Of course, it refers to a particular man. And how he got the word Cush, we don't know, but it certainly doesn't refer to our studies of Cush here. But you see that this is a Psalm of David concerning the words of Cush the Benjamite. But that really doesn't have anything to do with what we're studying. But Isaiah 11:11 does. If you want to go back to Isaiah 11:11, Cush is mentioned here. It shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Now this is number 15, which is down here around the first cataract of the Nile River. Now, by the way, since we've covered all the Japhethites that we're going to cover, you can kind of see the area where they are. And the other names that we left out, like Gomer, Tubal, Meshech, Togarm, and so forth, they're going to be found, you can at least guess, somewhere around in this general area. So you can see that the Japhethites, Spain, of course, is over here. This is our last one to the west. That would be a Japhethite settlement, and that would be Tarshish. The Japhethite section is a fairly straight line from Spain all the way over here to the southern coast of the Caspian Sea with Madai, or with the Medes, that comprises some people that are a little bit further north, but you can see it's really a whole belt of people that run across. In other words, we don't find Japhethites way down here. We find them there in a certain area. Now, the boundaries that we just gave you, a fourfold boundary for the Hamites, I said was from Israel. This is the southern belt of the Near East over to around southern Babylon. And here we've got this black number, part of it anyway, which refers to Ham. I said Arabia, which is this area. I said Arabian Peninsula, which is this area. And I said northeastern Africa, which is this area. So those are the four general places that we find Hamites, but notice it's still in one big circle. So you see, once these men began to branch out, they all went in certain directions. You notice Japhethites pretty much went up north and then began to spread east and west. the Shemites are going to stay pretty much in this centralized location, and the Hamites end up down south. But the one we're on right now, Cush, number 15, which is around the first cataract of the Nile. Now that name appears many, many times in the Old Testament. It's translated Cush only twice. Who can guess how it's translated in other places? Everywhere else besides those two places, it's always mistranslated Ethiopia. Ethiopia of today is down here. Now this was ancient Nubia, Nubia, which today is the northern part of the country of the Sudan. Ethiopia, the people that are in Ethiopia may well have come from Cush, because we're going to be given Cush, and then, let's see, down in verse 7, we're given all of Cush descendants, which take up a lot of this area. And so that means that all of these people came from Cush, and no doubt the people that are in Ethiopia today came from Cush, but the Ethiopia today is not where ancient Cush began. That's why it's misleading, and even some of your better and newer translations still insist on giving us Ethiopia all the time. And you look it up in the Hebrew, and the word is Cush. You can't get an Ethiopia out of it. I mean, you know if it's an Ethiopia or a Cush. They're two entirely different words. And this today is the northern part of the country of the Sudan. Ancient Nubia was known as Nubia at one time. Now, we can't give you all those references. That's the one I'm going to let you look up in your concordance yourself, because there are just so many references to Ethiopians and to Ethiopia. One comes to mind, just to show you, it's in 2 Chronicles. I have to find the chapter here. One comes to mind, just to show you what you'll have to change. Well, a couple will come to mind here, but let's see, chapter 14 of 2 Chronicles. Verse 9. There came out against them Zerah the Cushite, with an host of 1,000, 1,000,000, and 300 chariots, and so forth. This was with King Asa, remember. Verse 12, so the Lord smote the Cushites, but they're called Ethiopians. And they'll be called that everywhere else in the Old Testament. They'll always be called the Ethiopians, or an Ethiopian, or the country of Ethiopia. Chapter 16. Verse 8, were not the Ethiopians a huge host? And it should be the Cushites there. Because Ethiopia then and Ethiopia now, although related as far as their racial context is concerned, they're certainly not related as far as their countries are concerned, because they're two entirely different places, although both are still in Africa. Now, in all those texts, you will find one, 2 Chronicles 21:16, that's a little bit different, so we want to turn to that one, which implies that there were Cushites on the western Arabian Peninsula. Now, we've got Cush right here. This is the Arabian Peninsula. Western part will be somewhere along here. So probably we end up with Cushites either here, and they migrate here, or here, and the vast majority of them migrate there. Whatever the case might be, most of the references are going to refer to them as being down here in Egypt, or south of Egypt, although we've got one that refers to them here, and that's 2 Chronicles 21:16. Moreover, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines and of the Arabians that were near the Cushites. Well, here's the Arabians right here. In order to be near the Cushites, there's probably a Cushite settlement somewhere here on the western Arabian Peninsula. So this is one text that's going to be a little different than the others that you might see. Now, the Cushites were our truly Negroid people, as we can prove from Jeremiah 13:23. They were our truly Negroid people. Now, other Negroid people have branched out from other names in Genesis 10, but we know from Scripture that the Cushites were black people. Notice Jeremiah 13:23. Can the Cushite change his skin, or the leopard his spots? In other words, he must have had some different colored skin than everyone else had around there. So he asks the question, can the Cushite change, in other words, the color of his skin? Another interesting passage is Numbers 12, verse 1. You might even have a marginal reference here in Numbers 12 and verse 1. Yes, you do. They gave us the correct marginal reference, Numbers 12:1. And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because he married a Cushite woman. Or because of the Cushite woman he had married, because he married this Ethiopian, or really this Cushite woman. So he married a woman that was from Cush, who was a black woman. Now, if you remember New Testament over in Acts chapter 8, we have Ethiopians mentioned. Remember the eunuch of Ethiopia under Candace the queen? Acts 8:27. And in the Greek, that word is Ethiopia. So we'll have to leave that just like it is, because it's certainly not Cush. When you transliterate it, you get much nearer the word Ethiopia than you do Cush. Still, it makes no difference. As I say, your people here in this area have descended from the Cushites. Your people in Ethiopia today, as well as the Ethiopia in the first century church's day, descended from people who were here in Cush. So it really makes no difference. You end up with the same group of people. One other text that is interesting is back in Genesis 2. Again, you've got the correct marginal reference here. And this shows us where the Cushites were probably in the very beginning. Now, we don't really know about these names in Genesis 2, whether all of these names were names that were true back in Adam's day, or whether they were names that were true in Noah's day, or more likely whether they were names that were true in Moses' day, since he's the one writing this. But if you notice in Genesis 2, in verse 11, we can start with, we are given a description here of where Eden is and where the Garden of Eden is. The name of the first river is Pison. That is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah, where there's gold. The gold of that land is good, and there's bdellium and the onyx stone. And the name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Cush. Now, the difficult thing about this text is the fact that since we know from the other rivers that Eden and the garden was somewhere right here, and since we know from history that Cush is down here, it's pretty much impossible that in these rivers that it's mentioning, and it happens to mention the Hiddekel and the Euphrates River, the Tigris and Euphrates here and Tigris here, the other two rivers that are mentioned have got to be somewhere in this area. And since it says that this particular river compasses the whole land of Cush, it can't mean this river goes way down here and goes around Cush, which means that probably we began with a Cushite settlement somewhere right here, and that makes more sense when you remember the 2 Chronicles 21 text for the Cushites that were right here on the western Arabian Peninsula, which means probably they migrated from here to here to here, and this is where they finally established themselves. Now remember, when we've got the three sons of Noah, we're all back up here in this area. They're not all living down here. It takes time for them to get here. So Cush probably branched off and settled somewhere right around here. Wherever this ancient river is, which isn't there anymore, that Moses said was around the area of Cush. And he couldn't be talking about this Cush. And he couldn't be talking about this Cush. So the only answer is he's talking somewhere in Tigris-Euphrates area, an earlier Cush that was up here, a site which was abandoned in favor of this site, the western Arabian Peninsula, which was abandoned in favor for the northern part of the Sudan. So that's fairly involved because you're going to find so many references to Ethiopia in the Old Testament. But in all cases it refers to Cush, and the Ethiopians refer to the Cushites. Again, number 15 right here. Okay, we go on to number 16, which is the second mentioned son of Ham. Oh, who would ever do what we're doing here tonight? Praise God. We got to work our way through the Bible here. It just blesses me every time I think about it, though, that got a church that'll sit here and listen to all of this. Praise God. Chapter 10, verse 6, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim. Literally, this word in the Hebrew says the two Mazors. It's really not a plural word, it's a dual word. Now, of course, to us, dual is plural, but not to them. Dual is dual, and then when you get to 3 and above, then you're to plural. But you either have singular, dual, or plural, and plural goes from 3 to above. Now, that'll become important in a moment. The two Mazors, M-A-Z-O-R. That's what the word literally says in the Hebrew. Now, this is very interesting because notice Mizraim can't be a person's name because it's in the dual. But since it means the two Mazors, here we've got, you have to remember what we had covered back when we introduced the table to you, where sometimes we can't tell the name of the person except working our way backwards and end up with part of the name somehow. Probably the son's name was Mazor. And when you turn it into the dual, you end up with Mizraim, which means that this son's initial name would have been Mazor. Now, why is it in the dual? Because it speaks of the two clearly recognizable distinctions in the land of Egypt between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Anyone that knows anything about Egypt knows there's an Upper Egypt whose climate and territory and soil is entirely different than Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is right down here, and Lower Egypt is up here. Lower is at the top, and upper is at the bottom. And that's where our number 16 is. Now, it's translated here Mizraim. It essentially is the same Hebrew word that's translated Egypt almost 500 times in the Bible. And here it's a tiny bit different, but still it's pretty much the same word in the Hebrew. Mizraim and Egypt are the same thing. I believe over in 1 Chronicles 1 it'll keep the name Mizraim. You don't want to go changing the names of Egypt. You've got 500 of them to change. When you talk about the children of Israel being delivered out of Mizraim, no one will know what you're talking about then. So there are some things that we just have to leave King James way or whatever translation, because we'd have to always have a sermon before a sermon to explain what Mizraim meant. Or you would have to have a sermon before your sermon when you were going to preach on the deliverance out of Egypt. No, it's not Egypt, it's Mizraim. And they'd wonder where in the world is Mizraim. So we'll leave it Mizraim here in the formal genealogical list, and we'll go ahead and call it Egypt everywhere else in the Bible. I mean, it's called Egypt today, and it would be difficult to change to Mizraim after so many centuries of it being referred to as Egypt. Now, something else that we mentioned about Mizraim is the fact that Ham, who is his father, is also mentioned as settling in the same area, Egypt, where Mizraim, or literally where Mazor settled. Let me give you a couple of texts that say that. Psalm 78:51. Psalm 78:51. They're all in Psalms. 105, verses 23 and 27. And 106:22. Now turn over to these and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Psalm 78:51. You see, remember, we're talking about Hamites, but specifically we're talking about the second mentioned son, Mizraim, but they're tied together in these three passages. Psalm 78:51. Now notice what this says. This is talking about their deliverance out of Egypt. Verse 51, he smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham. All right, 105, verse 23. This is very clear in 23. Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. Then verse 27, he showed the words of his signs among them, and wonders in the land of Ham. And then 106, 22, wondrous works in the land of Ham, and terrible things by the Red Sea. Which means that probably Ham ended up following his son, or maybe his son followed him, we don't know. Mizraim and Ham personally settled in this area as well, which for certain shows that all of Africa in the future was populated by Ham, and therefore all of Africa was comprised of Hamites. And so in these four places, Egypt in the book of Psalms is called the land of Ham. Not just because Mizraim is there, or why don't you call Canaan the land of Ham, since Canaan came from Ham as well? Or why don't you call wherever Put is, which I'm not going to tell you, but where I know, why don't you call Put the land of Ham? Which it's never called the land of Ham, since Put also came from Ham. Why is it this one particular one? Probably because Ham ended up back here where Cush is, or where Mizraim is, or Mizraim ended up here where Ham is, just depending on who came first. And you could ask the same thing about Cush, because Cush is a little bit further south, and that's not referred to as the land of Ham, only Egypt. So probably you end up with both of these characters there. Okay, number 17, Put. We skip. Number 18, Canaan. Now I hope you don't have to look at the map to find out where number 18 is. Now, it's seen earlier than any of the other names because it's seen, let's see, 5 times back in chapter 9. 18, 22, 25, 26, 27. Remember, Ham is always called the father of Canaan. Canaan keeps being mentioned back here in chapter 9, verse 18, verse 22, verse 25, 26, and 27. Now this was the most important son of Ham as far as Israel was concerned in the future. That's probably why Canaan is mentioned so much in chapter 9 as well as in chapter 10. Because beginning down with verse 15, we have the descendants of Canaan given to us. And in verse 19, we actually have a description of the land of Canaan given to us. Now, again, this name appears dozens and dozens of times, so we don't need to look at all of those in the Old Testament, but it is the name by which the people known as the Canaanites received their name, as well as the land of Canaan that Israel came into through their founding forefather Abraham. So the Canaanites as a racial group of people, as well as the land of Canaan, both received their name from this particular son of Ham, Canaan. The etymology of the name points in the area of meaning a depressed or degraded either land or people, and what that means we don't know. We know that most of Israel is in a depressed region. You take the Dead Sea, that's 1,292 feet below sea level. So we know it's depressed physically. And if you think of the spiritual quality of the Canaanites, they are certainly a depressed, degraded people. So which that refers to, whether to the land or to the people, we don't know. But it ends up, in fact, really referring to both of them as being descriptive of the land as well as the spiritual condition of the people. Okay, if you're with us thus far, we're down to verse 7. We've been given those 4 sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Remember, we're not going to be given any descendants from Put, only from Cush, from Mizraim, and from Canaan. And so in verse 7, we begin with Cush down through verse 12. So 7 through 12 deal with the descendants of Cush, but primarily verse 7, because verses 8 through 12 deal with just one of his descendants, Nimrod. So, in other words, we'll primarily be looking at verse 7, because here we have the immediate descendants of Cush. Now, we have his sons, first of all, and then we have two grandsons that end out the list in verse 7. Okay, we begin with Seba, which occurs two other places by name in the Old Testament. Psalm 72:10 and Isaiah 43 and verse 3. Now, before we go on, notice the end of verse 7. We have a Sheba there. But in the passage in Psalm 72, Seba and Sheba are clearly distinguished, the one from the other. So it's not a misspelling here or anything. Seba is one name, and Sheba is another name. We're going to look at the passage in a moment. And then in Isaiah 43, Seba is connected with, although distinguished from, Egypt, or Mizraim, we'll call it Egypt, and Cush. Now let's look at these passages. You see, this is what helps point us in the direction on where we're going to find Seba. Psalm 72:10.
For the continued.
Now let's look at these passages. You see, this is what helps point us in the direction on where we're going to find Seba. Psalm 72:10. The kings of Tarshish and of the isle shall bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. So you see, in Genesis 10, Seba's mentioned one time and Sheba's mentioned twice. But they are to be distinguished, the Shebas from the Sebas, because they are here in Psalm 72. Then Isaiah 43 and verse 3. Which will give you an opportunity to find another name change here, because remember, Ethiopia should be Cush. Isaiah 43 verse 3, I am the Lord thy God, the Holy One of Israel, thy Savior. I gave Egypt for thy ransom. You see, here it appears to be speaking of the Exodus here, that God destroyed other nationalities in an attempt to save his people, at which he was successful. And so somehow you've got these groups of people mixed together. I gave Egypt for thy ransom, Cush and Seba for thee. In other words, Seba must be located somewhere near Mizraim and Cush, which is where we've got it. We're on, what, number 19? We've got it just a little bit south of Cush. Now, 4 times in the Old Testament, a group of people known as the Sabaeans are mentioned. S-A-B-E-A-N-S. 4 times the Sabaeans are mentioned, but they're mentioned by several different Hebrew names. One of these, one of the 4, appears definitely to refer to Seba, and that is Isaiah 45:14. In other words, the Sabaeans, and we'll look at the other passages, 2 in a moment, we'll look at 1 right after this, but the Isaiah 45:14 passage of the Sabaeans refers to the people of the country of Seba, and they were known as Sabaeans, as well as the people of the country of Sheba. They were also known as Sabaeans, so it can become confusing, as most of this probably already has to you. Has anyone got everything down already? Just about? Praise God. Well,
One letter.
Isaiah 45:14. Someone called me to tell me something last night, and I told them I had 16 books spread out on my desk trying to pin all these things down. I had a list of them in another place, but I had to review all of it because, you see, some of these names are Aramaic. They're not even Hebrew names at all, and so you've got to find them in Aramaic dictionaries, and Hebrew doesn't do you any good at all, some of the names that we see in other places. So I don't know. It took a long time, and so it'll probably take you a long time to get it all down. Isaiah 45, verse 14. We are preparing you. You might not actually believe it, but we are. You asked for what, though, right? Thus saith the Lord, the labor of Egypt and merchandise of Cush and of the Sabaeans. Now you see, again, it's mentioned in connection with Egypt and with Cush, which again, just like the other text, would point us down to this area, somewhere northeast Africa, that would be near Egypt and that would be near Cush. So in this reference to the Sabaeans, it appears to refer to the country of Seba and the people of Seba. Now Ezekiel 23:42 needs to be changed to what you've got in your margin. It fits the context much better. Isaiah 23:42. It's talking about some of the sins of Aholah, the Holabah, the prophetic portrayals of the people of God here in Ezekiel 23, verse 42. You've got Sabaeans in the text. You've got drunkards in the margin. And this is not going to be referring to Sabaeans. They're too far away to be coming to Israel. And they certainly wouldn't be referred to, I believe it refers to them as, a people from the wilderness. And it wouldn't be referring to the Sabaeans like that. So you've got a little bit different Hebrew word here, and probably what it should be translated as is what you've got in your margin, and that's drunkards. It fits the context anyway. That's what it's talking about here, all the sin and the revelry of the people of God. So that's probably what it refers to. Now we'll cover the other references to the Sabaeans when we get to the proper name. Now you want to put that second list, that Hamite one, back up again. Here on the Hamite list, you can just leave it for a moment. Notice that we've got 3 asterisks by 3 names. I left out the Ludim one by Havilah, one by Sheba, and one by the Ludim. Why? It's because those 3 names appear both under the Hamite section and under the Shemite section. Havilah, Sheba, and the Ludim appear under both sections. So we're going to have to try to find out, why do we get 2 peoples, apparently 2 peoples, they go by the same name, but they're descended from 2 forefathers. So these 3, Havilah, which is seen in verses 7 and 29 of chapter 10, Sheba in verses 7 and 28, and Lud, or Ludim, I believe it's Ludim in verse 13, plural, and then Lud in verse 22. Havilah, 7:29, Sheba, 7:28, and Lud, or the Ludim, 13 and 22. The first occurrence under a Hamite division, the second occurrence under the Shemite division. Now we're introducing this because the next name we come to, number 20, is Havilah. Now most authorities agree that with Havilah, what we have is an intermarriage between Hamites and Shemites, thus ending up with a similar name, or really an identical name for these people. Number 20, if you want to go back to our map, places us down in south central Arabia. Now, that's why I have it, well, first of all, I'll go ahead and say what I was going to say. That's why I have it black and red, because it refers to both of these groups of people. First of all, to the Hamites, because Havilah occurs for them in verse 7 of chapter 10. And then it's partly Shemite, because down in verse 29 of chapter 10, the Shemites are spoken of as being the forefathers of this people or this place or whatever named Havilah. And it occurs under both Hamites. Now some authority and the Shemites, some authorities say we've got 2 different groups of people, 2 different places. That's possible. But it seems better, since the names are identical, and I'll show you another passage that when we get down to Sheba and Dedan over in the descendants from Abraham and Keturah, that probably what we've got here is intermarriage rather than two different groups of people. Now we do have a text back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 11. Matter of fact, we've got 3 Old Testament texts that appear to point Havilah in the direction of northern Arabia, which is where this is. This would be in the Arabian Peninsula, south-central Arabia. This is northern Arabia. There are 3 texts, and most of your authorities place it right here, and that seems to be true. That this is where Havilah is. It's the name of a place as well as the people. But we've got 3 Old Testament texts that appear to point Havilah up in this area, northern Arabia, rather than southern. Genesis 2 and verse 11, the name of the first is Pison, that is it which compasseth the whole land of Havilah. Again, we're back to Garden of Eden, and probably we're not going to be way down here where we've got rivers extending. Probably Havilah is right up here in this general area. Then we've got, let's see, chapter 25, 18, which has the same phrase as 1 Samuel 15 and verse 7. Now, in the passage here in Genesis 25:18, it's going to speak of the descendants of Ishmael, and it says that they dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, and we know where Shur is. Shur is right here. That is before Egypt, as thou goest toward Assyria. As thou goest would be coming backwards. In other words, Shur. And as you're going to Assyria, you would come to Havilah. Well, how could you come to it down here when Assyria is over here? You see what I'm saying? If you're going from Shur towards Assyria and you're going to pass through Havilah, it's got to be somewhere here in this general area. Now, the same thing is true in 1 Samuel 15:7, where we read that Saul was chasing the Amalekites from Shur to Havilah, which again is a straight band that stretches right across this area. But probably, since all authorities and ancient maps show them to be down here, they migrated down here at a later time. Because we've already seen in the past a lot of these are migrating sooner or later. Well, all of them have to because they start out up here. But some of them we know of when they migrate. So here we have the people in this Havilah that migrate down here, and this is where the general area has been established for Havilah. Okay, number 21. We come to Sabta. Sabta was probably the ancient chief city known as Sabtoa, Sabtoa, which was in extreme south-central Arabian Peninsula. Right here in the Arabian Peninsula, right in the center of it, the extreme south, Sabta. This is down where Yemen, South Yemen, Oman, and these countries are today. So that's 21. 22 is Ramah. Mentioned one other time, Ezekiel 27:22, Ramah. Probably points towards the Ramanites, Rhammanites, of southwest Arabia. Number 22, right here. Ramah. There was a group of people here known as the Rammanites. Don't know a lot about Sabta or Ramah. Or the next one, number 23, Sabtika. Sabtika, out of all the ones we've looked at so far, is totally unknown. But since it occurs right along with Ramah, it's probably in the general area of Ramah, so I've placed it right here, 23, Sabtika. It's totally unknown, so we've got to guess on where it would be. And probably it's going to be near Ramah. Okay, now we come to the 2 sons of Ramah, which are two grandsons of Ham, Sheba and Dedan, which will finish out verse 7 of chapter 10. Okay, Sheba, we'll give you the text for that first of all. 1 Kings 10, verses 1 through 13. 2 Chronicles 9, verses 1 through 12. Job 6:19. Psalm 72, verse 10, verse 15. Isaiah 60, and verse 6. Jeremiah 6, and verse 20. Ezekiel 27, verses 22 and 23, and Ezekiel 38:13. Now Sheba, just like Havilah, appears in a Hamite list as well as a Shemite list, and as Havilah, we probably got intermarriage here, so we end up with one group of people, although the name occurs in both places. Sheba was a very famous trading nation, which sent out long trading caravans of camels and dromedaries. You look over in the book of Job for a moment, we have one of those other references to the Sabaeans. Job 1:15. Remember, that was one of the evils that plagued Job. The Sabaeans fell on, I believe it was his oxen. Job 1:14 and 15. There came a messenger unto Job, and we know that Job is living somewhere over here. You have to keep that in mind. And said, the oxen were plowing, the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them, and took them away. Yea, they have slain thy servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Now, this doesn't refer to Seba, and it does not refer to Sheba proper as far as the country that we're going to show you where it is in a moment, because they were a peace-loving, commercial trading nation. They wouldn't attack people like these Sabaeans did. But evidently what the case here is, as well as in Joel 3 and verse 8, the final and fourth reference to Old Testament Sabaeans, Joel 3:8, the Sabaeans were a branch from Sheba. But they didn't end up down here where Sheba actually ends up, because the characteristics and the mannerisms of the people of Sheba are entirely different than these two groups of Sabaeans, one in Job 1:14 and 15, and the other reference in Joel chapter 3 and verse 8. There in Joel 3:8, I think they're referred to, again, as slave traders. And that was not what the people of Sheba were involved in. Okay, how can we locate them? Well, let's look at a couple of passages. 1 Kings chapter 10, we can begin with. This will point out very clearly that she was a great trading nation. 1 Kings 10:1, and when the queen of Sheba, so at least in Solomon's time we know that it wasn't a king, but it was a queen which ruled on the throne in Sheba. When the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon and so forth, look at verse 2, she came with a very great train, and camels that bear spices, and gold, and precious stones, and so forth. A huge trading desert caravan here, people, which is what the country of Sheba was known for. 2 Chronicles 9 is the same account. Psalm 72 and verse 10. The kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents, and now we've got a king of Sheba, and the kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. And then down in verse 15 as well, we see her over in Ezekiel 27 and Ezekiel 38. Now, we happen to know from history where it is, but if you'll turn over to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 12, Jesus gives us a good hint of where we can look to find Sheba. One country colonized by a mixture, an interracial mixture of the Hamites as well as the Shemites.
Hallelujah.
Matthew 12:42, the queen of the south shall rise up in the judgment with this generation and shall condemn it, for she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, a greater than Solomon is here. So it has to be south of Israel. It has to be somewhere way on the border of land territories, the uttermost part of the earth, in reference to them. And here it is, way down here, 24, half Hamite, represented by the black, half Shemite, represented by the red. This is indisputable by anyone who knows anything about Sheba. It's way down here on the very tip of this Arabian Peninsula, which makes it south of Israel and which makes it the extreme ends of the earth. You fall off there and you fall into the Arabian Sea. So you're to the ends of the earth as far as they needed to be concerned at that time. Okay, Sheba was one son of Raamah. The other son is Dedan, mentioned in the following text, generally mentioned with Sheba and or other Arabian places such as Teman. We know that Teman was a famous Arabian city. So Dedan is generally mentioned with Sheba and or other Arabian places such as Teman, which tells us Dedan probably somewhere in Arabia, just like Sheba was. The texts are the following. Genesis 25 and verse 3. Isaiah 21:13. Jeremiah 25:23. Jeremiah 49:8. And then in Ezekiel 25:13, 27:15 and 20, and 38:13. Now Dedan, which is number 25, was placed right here in Arabia, and she was the important nation that controlled all northern southern trade routes that went in and out of Arabia. Of course, she's a brother to our foreign country all the way down here at the bottom, Sheba, so of course she would let Sheba in and out. And that's what she was known for, controlling the trade routes in and out of Arabia. Now the text in Genesis 25 we want to look at, because it mentions Sheba and Dedan again, but it's two different Shebas and Dedans, because they're descendants from Abraham through Keturah and through Jokshan. And probably, this is 25:3, probably again we've got an interracial marriage between these people that descend from Abraham through Keturah, through Jokshan, with the Hamite and Shemite people that had already come from Raamah, thereby ending up with somehow the same names of Sheba and Dedan. In other words, it doesn't necessarily have to be two literal sons, Sheba and Dedan, but they end up mixing up with Sheba and Dedan. You got to, some of the names in the Old Testament, well, as we're seeing from chapter 10 here, don't necessarily refer to a person. They can refer to just about anything there. Although eventually we trace them back to someone, though we may have lost their name. But it's just too strange to have here, and Jokshan begat Sheba and Dedan, two brothers, identical to what we have over there in Genesis 10, unless really it's referring to the same group of people that end up mixing together by means of marriage. Now, I believe this completes the descendants of Cush in chapter 10 and verse 7. We might just want to read here through verses 8 through 12. And then we probably need to stop for tonight, because then we'll open up next week with Mizraim, Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim, Caphtorim, and then the Philistine. We don't want to get into all of those names right now. Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. just for a moment skipping to verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, or Babylon, which, you probably won't remember this, but I'll point it out to you anyway. Remember that we said Cush probably started up here because one of those rivers in Genesis 2 said it circled Ethiopia, which was Cush, or at least went through it. And since we know it couldn't be referring to Cush way down here, or Ethiopia here, it had to refer to a Cush somewhere in this region. Verse 8 and verse 10 are another text for that, because Cush begat Nimrod, and Nimrod's kingdom is Babylon. That must mean that Cush is somewhere in this area when he begats Nimrod. He's not down here, and then Nimrod comes back to Babylon. So Cush must still be here. He begets Nimrod, and then it's not until a later time that Cush ends up migrating to, first of all, here on the western Arabian Peninsula coast, the eastern coast of the Red Sea, and then all the way down here south of Mizraim, or south of Egypt. So Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. See, these verses are interesting because they isolate this one man. Famous man from ancient history, Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, so there was a saying that went around his day, even as Nimrod. If you wanted to compare someone to a certain characteristic, which I'm not going to say what it is yet, you compare him to Nimrod, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, and the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Ashur, and builded Nineveh. So you know about Nineveh there. The city Rehoboth, and Calah, Resen, between Nineveh and Calah, the same is a great city. That brings us to verse 13. I think we'll stop there tonight. You probably got plenty to remember. And we'll pick up with the descendants of Mizraim and hopefully be able to work our way through the list. Some of the other ones are a little more obscure as we go along in the list as compared to some of these early ones that we've already mentioned. Now, is there something I need to repeat somewhere on here? I mean something that you put a note by to go back and get it. Hallelujah.
Like with the nations of Cush, were they also Negroid? I mean, as far as after Ham, when did the Negroid actual, the color change? Did that happen with all of Ham's descendants, or was it just like Ethiopia, the Cush sector, or was it?
It didn't happen with all of them. Of course, it didn't happen right away. It only happened in isolated groups, such as Cush. But then people in other areas of Africa today had descended from Cush. You see, not all people in Africa are black. I guess you realize that. Your people up on the northern coast are not black. But you get down to your people in Central Africa, and they are black. A lot of them just have, dark tan skins. And they would all still have come from Ham, but obviously they wouldn't have come from Cush. And which one of the sons besides Cush also ended up in this area, we're not for sure. We're just positive that the Cushites, because of Jeremiah 13:23 text, as well as just from history. By the way, something I can add about Cush that I remember studying from the writings of Herodotus, the Greek historian. He himself said that the Cushites were black men, and we actually have paintings from them that show them being very dark. They would paint their whole face black to show that they were a black people. That's kind of hard to show, when you're painting something. You don't have a lot of colors to use, but Herodotus said that the Cushites were the tallest and the most beautiful people in the whole world of his day, which is a lot to say as far as the Negro people that he knew of anyway in Africa. They were extremely tall people, and they had just they were black, but they have just perfect facial features and features on the rest of their body. And you've seen black and white people that are just perfect in their proportions, and he said all the Cushites were like that. They were the tallest people in the world, and they were the most beautiful people in the world, although they were black. One announcement I want to make, I've been meaning to make it for several weeks and get so wrapped up in the teaching I always forget it. I believe the Lord's leading us to have another love feast here, so I've got it planned for the second Sunday in October, which I don't know is 2 or 3 weeks away. So pass the word to anyone who's not here. The second Sunday, second week, second Sunday, whatever date that is, in October. Bring your love and your fellowship, one-mindedness, unity, spiritual fellowship, and we'll gather together and feast together, worship the Lord, study the Word, pray, testify.
Amen.
And I might even bring another treat for you. Some people have been wanting to know some things about, well, I know a lot of you have, about our past and where we're from. So one thing that I've always been involved in since a teenager was amateur photography, and I have hundreds and hundreds of slides, and so I think I'm going to bring some of those slides. And you don't have to look at them if you're bored. You can go to the other room. But just to give you some pictures and some ideas of our background, particularly mine. Don't everyone bring your slides now because we'll never get through. You know, every time you go over father-in-law's house or something, he'd bore you to death with slides, but of course you don't have to come to that. You got to be here for the love feast, but you can go pray or something else if you're not interested in looking at slides. But I'm not going to bring all of them either. Of course, any ones that are defamatory, I'm going to pick those out. So I'll just bring ones that will highlight the past, you know. There are obvious ones that, of course, I wouldn't dare bring, but we'll give you, we'll show you some general things anyway, and those of you that are interested, we'll show you, where we went to school and where we went to church down in Tennessee, and it'd be interesting for you to know, since you are here listening to what I have to say all the time. Know something about us.